Excellent. Welcome back. So Chris Roop is here to present. And I believe similar to this morning's, you're going to go through your slide deck that is the interpretation of the deep nitty gritty details provided to us from the actuary. So this is an overview of the scenarios that we asked the actuary to look at regarding one-time or ongoing revenue. So let's go right ahead and jog through that.
Thank you. For the record, Chris Roop, Joint Fiscal Office. So yeah, as Representative Copeland-Hands has said, we received the results of the actuarial analysis a little less than 48 hours ago. So I spent quite a bit of time yesterday trying to hard input the data into Excel so I could put some graphs together and walk you through this in a way that's a little more visual and easier to understand. So the detail is in here and there's some graphs and charts, things like that. But just for discussion purposes today, I figured it'd be easiest to walk us through 10 or so slides just to pull out the high notes. Yes.
Okay. Which one, Chris, did you say what the detail is? What is
it's titled? It's got my name on it and it says 2 and 3 of additional funds for VSERS. Yeah.
And it's
I have it. Thank you.
So why don't we head over to page 2 of the slide deck? I just to sort of frame out the approach that was taken with this, just to throw some caveats around the analysis. This is all based on the FY20 valuation, which is the most recent data we have available. And we, for modeling purposes, are recognizing the impact of additional revenue immediately in that calculation. Because that approach leads to nearer term budget relief. If you exclude the additional revenue from the ADET calculation and just kind of go along in a status quo and act like the money never happened, the funded ratios of the pension systems would improve more rapidly and you would see more financial gains from interest and investment income over time. But the trade-off that we always face is that approach does not lead to near-term budget relief. And this analysis assumes that all future ADECs are fully funded going forward. And I didn't put it here, and hopefully it goes without saying at this point, but I'm going to say it anyway, that this also assumes that all of our actuarial assumptions are met moving forward. We obviously can't predict the future, but we have to assume our assumptions are good. So slide 3, let's start with looking at the one-time revenue first. The revenue for modeling purposes was assumed to be paid into the pension system on July 1st, 2022, which is the start of FY23. We also, because of timing reasons, remember the 2-year lag between when the valuations are done and when the ADEC is calculated, that additional revenue will first start impacting the ADEC calculation beginning in FY25. The funded ratio, though, will be impacted immediately as soon as the funds start getting that additional revenue, because unlike with investment gains, the contribution amounts are not smoothed over a 5-year period. So you see the funded ratio go up, but the ADEC calculation doesn't get impacted by the new funds until FY25, because the FY23 valuation impacts the FY25 ADEC. And that's because of the timing of how we do everything. So when you take a look at the one-time revenue and you, it's one thing to take a look at, sort of the amount, the lump sum. And we started with 4 different lump sums, the 50, 150, 250, and 400. But we also need to figure out, all right, what are we going to do with this money? Like, how do you apportion it between the different systems? So we asked the actuaries to run 10 different scenarios, which is one reason why the report is as long as it is. The chart and the scenarios we basically ran was, it says here, but put $50 million into each system. If you take the $150 million that's currently in reserve and you either split that money 50-50, so each system gets 75, you do it, you model so either system gets the full 150, so you put it all in one and then the other. And what happens if you split money in proportion to the fund's shares of the total unfunded liability? So if you look at it that way, it's almost a perfect 35-65 split. So the VSERS unfunded liability is about 35% of the total unfunded liability across both systems. The other 65% is the teacher. So that's the way that we ask the actuaries to model out what the impacts would be. You take a look at slide 4. There's some graphs here that go into much greater detail in the actuarial report. But the key takeaway here is that the more one-time revenue you put into the system, the greater the impact on reducing the amortization payments will be below the baseline. It's kind of obvious, but it's always good to visualize and see, how much more 400 moves it versus say 52 million. But overall, upward trend of payments over time remains, but they grow off of a lower base because that one-time slug of money lowers that base that those 3% increases are built off of moving forward. So we still reach 100% funded in 2038. Slide 5 takes a look at what happens to the funded ratio, which I gave you a sneak preview of. The more runtime revenue you put into the system, the more rapidly the funded ratio improves in the near term. In all modeled scenarios, however, the systems both remain on track to reach 100% funded by FY38. Slide 6 digs into the specific question of this $150 million that's currently in reserve. Yes.
Sorry, Molly, can I go back to a question on slide 5?
Sure.
So you were talking about getting to the 100% funded ratio, but we've talked about a healthy system being in sort of the 80 to 100, 80 to 90 range. Does this mean that top, the top line there is in the healthy range right at the initiation of putting in that money?
So, I think there's inherent subjectivity to the healthy range. That is saying, this is the VSERS example. But just for the sake of space, I didn't put charts for both systems. We can run charts for whatever you want, but I didn't have enough time or page length to model everything. This is just VSERS. And that assumes, that most aggressive scenario assumes $400 million going in. So VSERS is currently better funded than the teacher system. They're around 66%. So that would be sufficient to bring it from 66 to over that 80%. The way the actuarial math works is it always points the ADAC payment, so you're getting to 100% funded at the end of the amortization period.
Yeah, I remember you saying that before. Thank you.
So also on slide 5, so most aggressive one, the 400 million going into VSERS, is that based on 100% then going to VSERS and 0% going to VSERS?
Yes.
Okay.
That's just for the sake of visualizing what happens if, what it does to move the lines and the numbers and improve the funded ratio. So like I said, we've got all the data that we can run charts however you want for visual purposes. Overall trends are going to be similar in both systems. You're just going to be starting from a slightly different point. Okay.
It's not on the graphs. I'm just trying to, I saw these on the website this morning. I was trying to dig through it. I was trying to think about the timing of it hitting in 2024. You said 2025.
It would impact the ADAC beginning in 2025. The money is assumed to hit July 1st, 2023.
So that it would. What assumption is that based on?
We need the legislature to be able to appropriate the funds, and they're not in session right now.
Yep. So something enacted next session, it could take place that fiscal year, right? Because we'll be working on the fiscal 23 budget, right?
We're about to be, the administration is right now gearing up to do the FY23 budget, correct?
Yeah.
And that number is based on is going to be based on the FY21 valuation that is going to be released in a couple of months.
Why wouldn't it take effect at 0.4?
Yeah, what the actuaries told us. So the money would be recognized at the very end of FY22 or the beginning of FY23, but there's a delay because we're not going to have that actuarial report done until right before the budget.
Right, so we're using 21 data to build the 23, so you're going to use 23 data to build the 25.
Correct.
So when this dollar is going in 23, it just takes that much time before it changes that ADEC payment. It's just a lagging.
We had to make an assumption somewhere in this, and if that funding was recognized sooner, it would it moved the numbers a little, but not
Because
sizably.
23 ends, we're already at a session, 23 ends, 24 start. So we'll have already the assumption of 24 based on 22 data, because the 23 data won't be until the fall of, I'm getting confused in the years in my head, but you know what I mean? We're just gonna, so
Yeah.
it just
No,
takes a bit.
The actuaries,
That helps. That's, it's confusing to think through.
Right.
I was trying to think through it myself and I couldn't quite get there.
Yeah.
So it is still 2024 that the data will happen, but that'll be fiscal year 25.
and Mr. Clausen just helpfully pointed out that at the bottom of page 2 of this document from the actuaries, they explain the timing issue. But either way, regardless of like which specific month we're talking about it being, the revenue being recognized, the overall trends are going to be the same over
For
time.
sure.
So on slide 6, this sort of raises a question with a few scenarios of, all right, this is $150 million currently in reserve. What would happen if it's divided in different ways? So the first chart shows the impact of, if you just took $50 million of that total and put $50 million in each plan, what would happen? And you would see, just going down the chart here, you know, that would reduce the VSERS ADAC by just shy of $5 million in the first year and $91.6 million through FY38. The impact of that savings will grow over time. On the teacher side, $50 million reduces the ADAC by 4.9 million and the ADAC by 91.8 million. So the numbers are almost exactly the same in both systems. And yes, sir,
So that's 50 million each from 150 million.
correct.
So what happens to the other 50 million then in that situation?
That's up to you all to make a recommendation on. That's,
Gotcha.
that's not
Okay.
what we modeled. We
Yeah.
modeled it just what would happen if.
Just trying to
Yeah.
figure out where that
Yeah.
could come from.
So the the third column rather shows, you know, what happens if we split it equally, put 75 million in each? You can see that that lowers, you know, across both systems, that would lower the ADAC saving, lower the ADAC by about $14.6 million in FY25. And cumulatively through FY38, it would lower the ADAC across both systems by $275 million. 150 million gets you in either system, gets you very, very close to the same result. And if you split the money by that 35-65 ratio, which that far right column shows, it all pretty much gets you to the same spot with very minimal differences.
I was just gonna ask, like, so when we think of, you know, the $3 billion unfunded liability, would we be able to take 275? Like, how does that work in that calculation doing this? We added $150 million.
So it wouldn't lower the liability, but it would grow over time to lower the ADAC that we would otherwise have to pay.
It would,
It would have an immediate impact on the unfunded piece when you put the money in, and that impact would grow over time as the money grows over time. So this 275.2 at the bottom, and I failed to put in a minus symbol at the bottom right corner. But that 275.2 is what we would not have to pay through the ADAC budget if that additional money was put in now and grows cumulatively over that time. So that essentially results in savings to the taxpayer. So you'd pay, think of it another way, you pay $150 million now, you save 275.2 cumulatively through FY38.
And my memory is this is the ADEC over time, or is that in that last year?
That's through FY38.
Okay.
It's cumulative. This data will make a lot more sense in a couple slides.
We just want to say, Chris, thank you for taking the time to put this data. When I looked at the actuary's report, I wanted totals at the bottom. And
So did I, but I didn't want to pay for it. So I'd rather get the raw data and spend the time hard coding it and doing the math in Excel.
thank you, Rob.
All right. Are there any questions on slide before we move on? Okay. Hey, slide 7. All right. So this is what I was talking about. This data will make a lot more sense on slide 7. So I know this is tiny. It's especially tiny when you print it. But if you look at it electronically and blow it up, it's a lot easier to navigate. This data shows you in two tables what the impacts would be over the, compared to the baseline for both the ADAC and the funded ratio in different scenarios. So the only real thing I added here, other than what was in the actuary's analysis, was that column in the middle that's savings from baseline. So I wanted to make sure we could see in one clear way, okay, if we put that money in by this scenario and this time, what would that realistically be expected to do to the ADAC? So we can pull charts with this data to illustrate whatever scenario you all are interested in doing. But this is the raw data. If you have any questions or this way you can visualize how the impact of the money grows over time. And some of the savings in some of these scenarios that you'll see, particularly on the recurring side, are a lot bigger because we could actually reach 100% funded sooner than FY38 if enough recurring money is put in. But we'll get to that in a second.
Can you walk us through just one column?
Sure. So on the far left side is just the baseline data. That's status quo. The amortization payment is in the left side. The funded ratio is on the right. And then just as you move forward, the number at the top is the one-time revenue scenario that was modeled. So I think it starts on mine, 50 million, then 75, and then goes to some other numbers. If that money was put in based on the assumed time frame, you see that the impact starts being recognized in the ADAC in FY25, but it starts being recognized sooner in the funded ratio. And then just add your way down the middle column where it says savings from baseline. And that's just subtracting the amortization payment to the left of it from the baseline amounts on the far left. And then there's a total at the bottom there about, what is the total amortization payment from, FY21 all the way through the end of the schedule in FY38 and just sum up the savings right next to it.
Just to make sure I'm understanding that the table correctly. So if you take the BSERS and DSERS $50 million column, and that money goes in, say 50 million was allocated to each system. Across both systems, the unfunded liability will be reduced by 100 million. But by the end of the amortization schedule, you would see 91.6 million in savings in BSERS and 91.8 million savings in BSTERS for a collective savings of 183-ish.
Right, cumulatively over that 13-year or whatever period it is, yeah. And you just see as you work your way down, you see in the savings from baseline column, the savings number grows as you work your way down. Okay. Are there any other questions on one-time revenue before we pivot over to the recurring?
Sorry, I was trying to find the answer.
Sure.
So, looking at the charge that's in the legislation, we made, I think, whatever the percentages that that's reduced. That's
The ADAC, so yes, the fiscal targets are to reduce the ADAC by 25 to 100% of the size of the growth from FY21's budget to FY22's budget. I don't believe the legislation was specific about what year those ADAC reductions need to take effect. We would start seeing the benefits in that, yes. And the caveat goes back that, this doesn't recognize what's happened in the last fiscal year. We don't have that valuation data yet. So this is all based on last year's numbers. That's the most relevant and the most timely that we have. So you'll see these numbers change, over time, but generally the same pattern of impact is going to be consistent. Okay. Slide 8 pivots over to recurring revenue. So we had to make some different assumptions, consistent with this conversation that we had throughout the process. We did not tell the actuary where money would come from or the manner and means by which it's collected, the frequency by which it's remitted to the state. So we had to make some generic assumptions. The generic assumptions we made were that revenue of recurring of some lump sum amount would be enacted in the 22 legislative session to take effect January 1st, 2023. It's very, and we made this assumption to give some time for the fact that if this is something new, it takes time to get regulations published, it takes time to implement things. So, that might even be a little on the aggressive side, but we needed to start somewhere with an assumption. We assumed that 5/12 of the annual base revenue would be collected in FY '23 because many of our collections happen with a 1-month lag. So if something is taking effect 6 months through the fiscal year, you're not going to get 6 months worth of revenue recognized in that fiscal year. So we wanted to be realistic with the fact that you're going to likely get a little less than half of 1 year's revenue if you're starting something brand new January 1st. We assumed that the first full base year of revenue would be FY '24, and that base would be, I think we modeled 30, 50, and 75 million. That's the base amount. And then it would grow 2% a year off that base every year going forward. Again, it's hard to make a real strong prediction about what our revenue is actually going to grow by over time when you don't know what is being taxed or where it's coming from. 2% is a reasonable starting point for assumptions. The way we assumed the math would work is that no additional recurring revenue would be collected after the pension system reaches 100% funded, that it was a measure specifically for this, and that's just for actuarial modeling purposes, and that the mechanics of this would be that the funds are collected during the year, then they're paid to the systems annually on June 30th, and are in addition to the ADAC paid for that fiscal year. So we budget the ADAC for FY '23 and pay that sooner. So you would set up a revenue stream, collect that money, put it in a little pot, and sweep it over. And then future ADACs would recognize impact additional money coming in. And obviously we assume that the ADAC would be continuously paid fully going forward and that all assumptions are met. And for the timing reasons that we previously mentioned, the first year that the ADAC calculation would really recognize it as FY '25, but again, you'd see the funded ratio and the unfunded liability balance impacted immediately as the money comes in because we do not smooth out the contributions over a 5-year period. So with this one, we modeled just like with the one time, in the recurring, we modeled several different scenarios, 9 different scenarios, but they're very consistent with the approach that was taken in the one time. What would happen if we split the money 50-50? What if we put it all in one system? And what happens if you split it with that 35-65 ratio? Slide 9 visualizes the impact of the recurring revenue. Recurring revenue reduces the ADAC by increasing amounts over time. And in a recurring scenario, the funds receive more dollars over time than in a one-time scenario, obviously. Plus that revenue that you've paid keeps growing through investment gains. So the impact of that one-time revenue will further lower the ADAC as you move forward. And again, I use this example as the teachers because I don't want to just pick on the state system. But I just put a graphic here just to show you visually like what this looks like. So if there was 30, 50, and $75 million worth of recurring revenue going into that system, these lines represent what would happen to the amortization payments going forward. So you can see that as you get closer to 2038, the payments start flattening and start bending down. And with $75 million, you actually reach, you really accelerate your funding progress. The next slide 10 focuses instead of on the ADAC, just on the funded ratio and what would happen. And same story here, the recurring revenue accelerates the improvement of the funded ratio. And in some modeled scenarios, with enough recurring revenue being raised and assumed to grow at 7% every year, you could actually reach 100% funded a couple years sooner. So that actually translates into some pretty big savings if you don't have to pay 1 or 2 years worth of ADAC toward the end that you otherwise thought you would. Slide 11 takes a similar approach to what I did with the one time. And I ran the numbers and said, all right, if we split this $30 million, what does that do over time? And you can see that in all the different scenarios that were modeled, whether it's splitting it 50/50, putting it all in one and instead of the other, or doing that 35/65 split. The recurring $30 million of additional revenue assumed to grow at 2% over time and assumed to grow at 7% through interest will result in total ADEC savings of about $588 million with small variations. The next slide, 12, same calculation, only we modeled with the $50 million instead of the 30. With $50 million, you save more than $900 million. And in some of these situations, you get one or more of the systems to accelerate the funded ratio.
Sorry, I'm a slide back still. I was just wondering, so, okay, maybe it's, I saw the note, Bob, now to answer my own question. It's always
Just
helpful.
need to think time.
Right,
Think time.
yep.
But on the $50 million slide on slide 12, yeah, you start to see when you're getting into those kind of numbers that you reach 100% funded for some of the systems a little bit sooner than FY38. Slide 7 is not going to have any surprise, or slide 13 rather, it's my page 7. Same thing, but with $75 million. And that gets you, you know, some pretty significant savings. You know, you'd save over $1.4 billion in the ADEC. And the reason why some of these numbers are a little different is because the systems reach 100% funded at different years, and the revenue is assumed to go away. The last slide, slide 14, has the raw data, just like it had for the one time. So it's presented in the exact same format. So you can go through these scenarios and see what the cumulative impact is on the ADEC and the funded ratio for all these different dollars. And you can also see that there are some scenarios. I'm looking at the $75 million scenario. Under the amortization, you see a whole lot of zeros toward the bottom there. That's because that's enough money that the system would reach 100% funded sooner than 2038. So you'd have a couple of years where no amortization payment would be due. That's the quick and dirty of the actuarial analysis in 14 slides. So I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. Sir?
I might have missed the reading. So these are, so with like the recurring revenue, it doesn't include the 150.
Yeah.
Okay. You could start, you know, you wouldn't play with the numbers if you put the 150 and then the revenue.
We would have to model that, and it'd be ideal to be able to model that on FY21's data rather than FY20's. But you know,
That
you
makes sense.
can get a sense of the relative impact of those dollars. though.
And that'll be available end of October, right? The FY
Yeah, most likely. Somewhere around then.
I was gonna just point out a similar thing as Molly, just trying to think about when we submitted these to Siegel and when we got them back. I was just trying to think what the turnaround time was on that.
For this one, it was about 2 weeks.
Does it become helpful, I guess, procedurally if they already have some of this, then plug those things together a little faster?
I think so, probably. And yeah, this took some time because it's a lot of exhibits for them to produce. And because we did ask them to model a lot of scenarios. The analysis itself isn't enormously technically complicated. It is for me. It is not for them. But the sheer volume of scenarios to be run and the time it takes to put 20+ pages of exhibits together takes some time.
So if we were just to limit the scenarios to more, just randomly throwing this out there, if we said 50-50 for everything moving forward between VSTRs and VSTRs, then that also enhances the turnaround time.
Yeah, I would. So I don't want to speak for them because they're also working on other things too. I would say that it streamlines the complexity and cost associated with the request. This was not an inexpensive request.
Yeah.
Sorry, Chris, this is not a question, but it's a comment. The one-time revenue shifts the base, but it's really impressive to see what recurring revenue does towards really bending the cost curve, in whole. I was pretty blown away when I looked at these graphs. First. Still, pretty impressive. So.
Of course, another great recession in later this decade could completely throw a wrench in the whole thing, but yeah, you're right. I'm a contrarian investor.
But I think it also like, in my mind, like when I look at some of these scenarios where it's like, oh, like we could pay this off in 2034, 2036 fiscal year. That might not be the bad way to shoot because we know that there's a known unknown out. We know something's gonna happen and we know there's gonna be, we don't know what it is or to what level. So it'd be better if this group can, or maybe when we make this change, be a little more conservative in the sense that like trying to overcorrect a little bit so that if we miss assumptions to the downside, we're not back here in 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 years in the same issue. And so, you know, like, do we consider that? Like, that's what I'm playing in my mind. Cause it's like, I don't want to like just get perfect and then something happens and we're off again where we overshoot. I'd rather be here in 10 years being like, we got too much money in the system. Like that's, you know, that's a different problem. So that's just where I'm thinking on some of it.
Well, and I would just add on to that, like building in that possibility for a positive
Right.
differential in there by putting in what you were talking about earlier, like, you know, things that would only occur in the event that we're still at a deficit or that.
Chris, I'm just going to look at this 50 million recurring revenue split and the savings and all of the things that we can get out of that. Is it safe to assume that that's not including whatever portion of the 150 that we put in after that?
Correct. That the recurring analysis
Theoretically, this
does.
would be sooner because of the one-time money we put in. Is that accurate?
I think theoretically, that's right. The more money you put in, it's likely going to accelerate the funding. I can't tell you it's going to mean you're going to be 100% funded 1 year sooner because
Yeah.
that requires some analysis. But yeah, generally, the more you put in,
This is just saying, if starting today, you put 50 million in on top of every year, this is what it would look like.
right.
Not include, okay.
And that 50 million is assumed to go up by 2% a year as overall tax base growth goes up. And that money that you've put in is assumed to keep growing at 7% consistently every year.
Thank you.
So the benefit really does compound itself over time.
So I have a nagging question in the back of my mind, and I'm not sure I'm going to be able to articulate it well. But the trend line on your graph of the baseline increase from which we see those nice, pleasant, wonderfully colored reductions in that trend line. When we go back in time from this moment, from the beginning of that graph, that's not the trend line that we have seen in past ADEC
No, it's not.
payments. And so I'm just curious how that trend line was chosen and like sort of given the past 7 to 10 years, what could that trend line, what could that baseline possibly differ by?
Sure. So what really drives the trend line is statutorily, the amortization payments are structured to increase by 3% a year moving forward. So the amortization payment in FY23 will, add 3% to get the amortization payment for 24 and so on and so forth. So that trend line increases. I'm talking about the ADEC slide, not the funding ratio slide. Those future payments increase at the assumption that they're going up by 3% a year. In the past, leading up to this point, we have seen increases over time much higher than 3% a year because the balance of the unfunded liability has grown due to other factors. So it's grown by, experience deviating from assumptions, and it's grown from changes to assumptions. Those are the two major sort of drivers of it, which we talked about earlier. And the chart that we discussed first thing today with all those steps, that waterfall chart shows you how it's grown over time. As a result, our amortization payments have grown at a rate faster than that. They used to be structured for the first 10 years or so of the amortization period to increase at 5% increments. But I think starting in, it was either FY19 or 20, moving forward from there, they increase at 3%. So what we see is when you have a really big change in the numbers from year to year, that base from which the 3% future increments is calculated off of goes up. So that means all those future payments start up from a higher base. So that's why you see in the one-time revenue slide that that upward trajectory is still there. It's just the base lowered a little bit because of the one-time money.
Just to add on what you were talking about, there have been many years that we've gotten a letter from the treasurer's office that has said, so this was the plan to ADAC. We need to add this much more to it because of different assumptions. The returns did not meet the expected returns. And so that 3% or 5%, depending on what year it was actually far more than that as far as it growth from one year to the next. And that also plays into why I'm saying all along, the general fund cannot keep up with, afford to keep up with the growth in the projected growth of payments, because it's not just 3%. I've never said that. It's always been more than that.
Yeah. And if I could just add to that, revenues, if you take a look at the FY 21 base or FY 20, I did this calculation a couple weeks ago, but if you take a look and see what revenues are projected to grow by through FY 26, the compound annual growth rate is less than 3%. So things is less than 3%. So I know there's a lot of attention on how things are at this moment right now, but when you take a look at how big that growth in expense was in such a short period of time, and how moving forward toward FY 26, revenues are projected to grow less than 3%. So long term, there's sort of a structural imbalance here between how the payments are structured and the growth of the revenues, which kind of gets us back to our conversation around the word unsustainable.
I think maybe it's more of a question for Michael. How does kind of this information connect with the letter that Treasurer's Office sent out last week? And since we last met, that was released, we haven't had a chance to discuss that.
I think that the key difference is the modeling that was done sooner or previously, around 40 million. Took a look at what would happen if you apply the money to the end of the amortization period and didn't recognize it immediately in the ADAC. Because the charge of this force is to come up with recommendations on the ADAC relief, the budget relief side, the analysis focused on recognizing that the impact immediately rather than deferring it. Because if you defer it until 2038, you're going to see more efficiencies in terms of investment gains funding the system, but at the expense of the near-term budget relief. You know, you're basically going under the assumption as if that money didn't exist.
I know we're running short on time, so I'll set the agenda. My head is full of lots of numbers. If we could come back to this conversation too next week, just that treasurer's report piece, just because I want to make sure I fully understand that. And honestly, at this point at 3:40, I don't know that I'm fully getting it. To get that on the agenda, that would be great.
Yes, thank you. This must have been hours of time in the last, how many of the last 48 hours did this?
I stopped counting a long time ago.
You don't want to.
He's on salary.
It's depressing to count.
No overtime there.
That was a financial burden to the state, those extra hours.
Chris, I appreciate you burning the midnight oil if that's what it took in order to turn this around quickly for us. It was to have your interpretation of the actuary's report, because we may all have been a bit lost for a week trying to decipher that.
Yes,
Yep.
yes.
Thank you.
Okay, should we jump to,
So unfortunately, it looks like we're not gonna have time to dive back into our brainstorming, but I believe we left off at the beginning of the reduce liabilities sections. And Jeanette has the notes that members of the task force have shared as far as yay or nay, or put this higher on the list or put this lower on the list, or however it was that you all categorized it. So I think rather than diving into this for 5 minutes and then switching gears, we should probably
Yeah.
just switch gears and put that at the beginning of our agenda for next time.
And I will try to, with Chris, go over the ones that we talked about today. And the ones that were open for more information and more questioning, and the ones where we were in some general agreement. And put that together so that we have that for next week. If that's okay with you, Chris.
The quick note on that, I don't think we discussed the last item before reduced.
Oh, you are
We did-
correct.
We
Yep.
did not.
So
You're right.
Just so we pick up from there.
Yeah.
That's my
We did not. That was,
Service credit purchases, yes,
Yeah.
we'll go back up to that. So before we start talking about next meeting, the other requests to add to today's agenda was to spend a few minutes talking about reflections on the last meeting. And I think we ought to just sort of level set some expectations about how much time we want to spend doing that, given that we also need to spend some time talking about the agenda for the next meeting. So do you want to try to do 10 minutes of reflections on last meeting? And then while we're doing that, folks can make note of things that they'd like to have on future meeting agendas. And then we can maybe do agenda planning for 10 minutes. Does that make
sure, I
sense?
must admit that the last meeting is so jumbled up in my mind now with today's meeting that I'm not sure I have any recollection.
I know, I'm coming back to you.
Well,
I will say from a broad perspective, not scenario, I think the last meeting and this one, I think we've taken, at times there's been disagreements. I think we are taking steps closer to finding areas where we do agree. And I think going into last meeting, I was discouraged that I didn't think we'd find common ground on much, but I think we're getting to the point where we're still ways to go and they're still negotiating, but I do think we're gonna find something, what that looks like remains to be seen, but I do think
I see more of an openness over the last few meetings and that has me encouraged, going forward.
Yeah, I thought it was helpful when we were running through this list today, just to get a pulse from the room in general. I think that was a really good use of time and just really helpful, and I'll echo what Corey said.
Other comments or?
Yeah, I really, I thought the presentation from NASRA last week was really helpful in just putting our plans in, giving it some context to the plans. And, one number that jumped out at me from the NASRA presentation was when they looked at pension spending relative to all their spending. And Vermont was actually below the median. So that, it suggests to me that I think it is really hard to fund it the way we've been doing it, to find all those, every dollar in the general fund. But it does seem like the capacity overall should be there. So, I think, these are obligations and, we need to figure out a way to make sure they're funded sustainably. And I think a lot of the conversation we've had today was really helpful in that regard. I'm also encouraged that we'll find common ground to get to a good solution. So I just found that presentation really helpful because we talk about these numbers and they're really big, but knowing how we compare to other states is also helpful. We're not alone. We can get our hands around this.
We're losing the commissioner back to the governor, back to COVID, actually.
Nice to hear you on the radio.
Was that even better to see it first?
Right, so let's just jump to agenda planning. If you want, unless somebody has more, I didn't see any more observations around.
You want to have cookies, but
You have cookies for everyone. They're gonna start on the 10th. Let's see, now, would this be considered a gift of minimal
less than
value
$15.
or should we declare this on our lobbying form?
Well timed, given that we're all sort of lagging in our energy here at the end of the day.
Yes, thank you.
Any other observations? Oh, excellent. Even better than I can have one.
Leona, I'm gonna bring it home and share because the cookie that I got from the cafeteria, I think it was more like 2.5 cookies all.
Classic. Oh, thank you so much.
Any other reflections on the last meeting? So can I suggest that we put reflections on the last meeting first on our next agenda so that we don't miss that? I doubt if we will need a full 30 minutes to reflect on the previous meeting. So that puts us at 9:15 to continue brainstorming for the actuary. Resume our discussion with with our reactions to this. Does that make sense? Other things folks want on the agenda? I think I heard you say you wanted the treasurer, you wanted to, what specifically was that you
Yeah, if we
wanted?
could go through the report that the treasurer's office released. You know, I know that Chris addressed a little bit there, kind of how it matches up with what the actuaries have run through, but I want to make sure that we spend some time on that because I know it was released in between our last meeting. I just want to make sure I'm understanding it all.
I was wondering if there was going to be a time where we might speak directly to the actuary folks.
I don't
Think we have
know
a,
that.
I don't think we have access necessarily because there's this formal process where we've been directed to have the joint fiscal office, meaning Chris Root, make the request through the treasurer's office who speaks to the actuary. Is that right, Michael?
Yes. The others, really don't provide. The contract with them for services, most of which is around developing three systems.
Could I ask you a question, Mike, just out of curiosity? This number of the average pension number is like $24,000 per state employee. Have you ever run it? Now that's all employees. Is that accurate?
Yes, basically they take out, it's a calculation of the total benefits paid in a given year divided by the number of retirees.
Have they ever looked at what what a career employee's average would be? Like, for instance, if that 24,000 is part of people that work only 5 years or 6 years or a small portion, I'm just curious if they ever looked at what, a career employee who works 20 to 30 years, what that number would
I'd have to
be.
go back and look to see if they've ever run any numbers, like 5-year cohorts, for example, like
Sure.
somebody with 25 years versus 30 years versus 20 years, 15. I could ask that question to see if that's been generated, but the average as it's presented is, as I said, just simply taking the total benefit payouts divided by
Sure.
the number of people, beneficiaries, if you will.
Gotcha. All right, thank you.
Sure.
So I am going to suggest that, I just looked at my calendar. And we have a meeting on the 15th, right?
Yes.
And one on the 22nd. We don't have a meeting the next week. And
Actually,
on the 6th, I think we have to start getting our report put together, because on the 13th, we have to finalize it. Because it's due on the 15th. This is just a draft report. I mean, this is
A progress report.
a progress report. But so we need to spend some time on that. So we should get as many questions answered in the next 2 sessions as we possibly can.
One of the things I think we also need to come back to is we haven't figured out logistics for the public hearing. I think last time we agreed Zoom would probably be the best format to capture as many people as possible, and then it would be a session in addition to one of our meetings. So if we could put that on the agenda and figure out when that would work.
Yeah.
That would be great.
Yep, I think I think we need to.
Anything else folks want on the agenda for? Oh, Eric.
I apologize, took a bite of cookie at an inopportune time, but we had talked about hearing from speakers on the net economic impact of pensions. And I did have their executive director reach out to me again and just said if they were willing to testify. So I asked him what his availability was, so I hope to have an order report back when we could get that testimony on the agenda.
Are you expecting that might be able to happen at the next meeting on the 15th? Or are you thinking that this is?
I
Weeks out.
expressed that the earlier that they could do it. I just shared with him when our next meeting dates were and said that the earlier that it would occur, the better. I have not heard back from him yet.
Be good if we could get them next week.
At 1 o'clock, ideally.
Sure, I have not heard back from him. I have not.
All right, anything else folks want on the agenda for next time? I think this will give us time to complete our discussions around the brainstorming for the actuary and possibly even get to the point where we talk about mixing and matching, scenarios so that we can start putting together. I mean, it's much more complicated than the combinations of scenarios that we just looked at from the actuary. And so given how complex their 18-page report is on those sort of straightforward scenarios, you can imagine how much more complicated the next work is going to be. But if we can get to that next week, that sounds great.
Like that, Madam Chair, Judith, I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that we are getting to the point where the actuaries are going to be very, very busy doing their first priority, which is evaluations for the funds. And really from about mid of this month to mid-October or so is very busy for them. So I think the sooner we can coalesce around what we'd like model, the better, obviously. But it may take a little while to get those funds. So we may not have a process prior to the middle of October. So I just want to make sure we're all aware of this.
So the way I've always sort of thought about this in my mind, and you all can tell me if you prefer to think of it in a different way, but I always figured that if, as we go through finishing our possible options discussion and put them into some scenarios to send to the actuary, that once we've gotten that information back and looked at it and digested it and understand, does it get us between 25 and 100%? Does it get us to those targets? Is it too much? Is it too little? Do we want to do a little more of this or that? That we would then have to make a second ask of the actuaries. And so when Chris talks about how long it's going to take during this busy season for the actuaries, I guess I would hope we could think about getting doing some real tough work next week on figuring out what the first blush scenarios might look like, knowing that it's going to be 2 or 3 weeks before we get that back. And then we'll want to digest it and do a second round. Does that make sense?
And my question kind of dovetails on that, which is, what do you see, like, is the first round won't include the October numbers, right? And so is that, it is beneficial because we have to use what we have right now, but then would they be able to quickly add in those numbers and get us more
They should be able to refresh the analysis
pretty quickly?
pretty quickly
Okay.
once all that stuff's done. It's just a matter of, I think, getting a sense of where we really want to focus the work on.
Okay.
You know, and the numbers can be updated. Much easier than starting. over.
Starting from scratch. Okay, thank you.
So, you know, Andrew mentioned the treasurer's memo, and there's a footnote in there saying there's another memo going to be prepared on OPEB. Do we have any idea when we're going to receive that memo? Michael?
I'll have to check with her. I don't know the status.
Yeah, because the reason I raise that is, you know, I really haven't touched too much on OPEB yet in the task force, and, you know, it would be great to get that memo as soon as possible so that we can start focusing a little more on OPEB and determine whether we want to run any actuarial numbers that are needed. But I assume that that memo will include some actuarial information. So
I'll check with her.
thank you. Yeah, I apologize. I think this question came up when I was outside the room, but the idea of talking with the actuary and why I thought that might be useful so we can hone in some of the asks to the actuary, like specifically around the amortization schedule or potentially around any incentives we might want to design. I missed the conversation, so I apologize for that. But I hear that that is not, that's not possible. Is that correct?
Yes, I think that's.
Correct.
Is there someone who you would, I mean, so far, we have relied on Chris to sort of interpret the things that are coming back from the actuary and to help us understand how we might triangulate based on other actuarial analyses of similar things. Is there someone else that you think you would like to have access to, short of talking to the actuary to do that fine tuning, or?
Well, it just with the incentives particularly, it seems like it hasn't, there's not a lot of good examples out there. So I thought talking with the actuary might kind of illuminate, okay, what would be the best, you know, levers to push that would, you know, might be incentives that don't increase the actuarial liability. But I think, I mean, if we have to just vision it ourselves and send it off, that's fine. I just thought it might be more efficient to have some input from the actuary, kind of discrete set of questions.
Right.
It is what it is.
No, I think there's a lot of value in understanding the extent to which something that might be offered as an incentive is counterproductive or can be made productive.
Right.
I agree with you on that. And I think to some extent, Chris has been giving us that feedback as we've been talking about it. All right. Anything else? Super.
Team
Thank you all.
1, 2, 3.